Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the new Meeples and Miniatures miniature review show. Today we're going to be looking at some figures from Alban Miniatures. We're going to be looking at their range of British Line Infantry, and these models are actually in 1/56 scale. Now, Alban Miniatures have been trading since 2008 and is owned by a chap called Paul Hammond. The miniatures themselves are actually sculpted by a guy called Richard Ansell, who is actually quite well known around the miniatures community. He's sculpted ranges for the likes of HLBS, he's done some stuff for the North Star, and loads of other bits and pieces as well. Now, what's unusual about Alban is the fact that the miniatures are actually sculpted in 1/56 scale. Now, what does this mean? Well, 1/56 is the actual scale of 28mm miniatures. As you can see here, we've got on the left a typical 28mm miniature. This is actually taken from Warlord's English Civil War range. And on the right we have an Alban miniature in 1/56 scale, and you immediately see the difference. And the bottom line is quite simple. 28mm miniatures, by their very nature, have a tendency to be pretty bulky because of the casting process. They've previously been pretty much bulked up, and they tend to have big hands, big heads. So they're almost a caricature of human anatomy. What Alban Miniatures are attempting to do are to produce a range of miniatures which are much more realistically scaled as far as the anatomy is concerned. Now, the upshot of this is twofold. First off, the figures look very different from what you'd expect from a 28mm figure. They look a lot slighter, they're a lot less chunky. Secondly, and probably more of a downside actually, is that you may have compatibility issues using these figures with other figures in your range. For example, you put these alongside something like Front Rank, and they will look completely different. So whilst anatomically they look so much more accurate, you may have an issue if you're attempting to add new figures to an existing army. On the flip side of this, of course, if you look at something like Het's new 28mm range of Napoleonics, they're liable to be of actually a very similar scale to these particular minis. Okay, so let's look in detail at some of the packs that you have available. First off, pack BR6, which is Line Kneeling Fending. Now, these are the sort of figures that you will see most likely when an infantry unit is formed square, and these guys will actually be the guys on the front rank of that square. So, potentially, from all these figures we're about to see, these are maybe the least useful, or at least the most limited in scope. So as you see here, there are 4 different poses. And it's worth noting for actually all these particular miniatures, these are actually the Peninsular War uniforms. So we have Stovepipe Shako. And as you can see, they're in full kit, complete with backpack, water bottles, etc. So we can see 4 variations on the particular pose. It effectively looks like we've got a couple of different dollies in use here, with 2 changes in heads and head position. So whilst it caters for people who like to see their units regimented, i.e. they're all in the same pose, not every miniature looks exactly the same, which is going to be a common theme we're going to come across in all of Alban's packs. So let's have a look at this miniature a little bit closer. I think the thing most striking about it is just it's a really good level of detail. Nice, sharp sculpting, all the detail is crisp, and good facial features as well. Considering the facial features are not exaggerated at all, overall the effect of the mini is great. And finally, here's a picture off Alban's website showing the pack fully painted. So it gives you some idea of what it may look like in its final form. Next up, we have pack BR7, which is British Line Centre Standing Firing. Again, a pack of 4 miniatures in the same basic stance, but in 4 slightly different variations. So again, that allows that regimented look while still maintaining a certain amount of variation. Again, very sharp, crisp sculpts. Excellent castings, actually. It should be noted that all these minis, I haven't touched them. They've come straight out the packs. So very little flash. So yeah, actually a very clean set of miniatures. Again, let's look at this particular miniature a little bit more close up. 2 things that immediately strike again. First of all, the apparent spindliness of the figure. In this particular pose is really apparent. The musket, again because of the casting process, actually looks slightly oversized. You compare this to something like, Perry-plastic infantryman, for example. It is apparent that the musket looks slightly large. That is simply a limit of the casting process. If the musket was cast in actual scale to the figures, it simply wouldn't come out the mould. So there is a little bit of Well, it's simply down to practicality. So while the majority of the model is, for want of a better phrase, realistic and proper scale, the musket is a little large. This does make for a figure looks slightly unwieldy, a little bit ungainly, and I know several people have been off-put by this, because the figures do not look like 28mm figures. They look different from what people expect them to look. It's a slightly different aesthetic, which I think is most apparent in this particular pose. And finally, we see a picture as they appear on the website, fully painted, just to give you some example of what they may look like on the table. Next up, we have pack BR8, which is British Line Centre Standing. 4 variations on a theme. Essentially the same dolly, this one, just with 4 different heads. Again, you'll notice the crispness of the poses here. I did have a slight problem with a couple of these, essentially because of the musket being bent over. It's probably during the poses where they've been taken out of the mould. And so there is a certain amount of adjustment that I had to make to these figures in order to straighten the muskets, basically. But again, as you see it up close, the sharpness and quality of the Mini becomes apparent, especially the fact that because these legs are so close together, you'd probably expect to see flash between the legs of this particular model, and that really isn't the case. So very well cast figures, these. And here again we see the variation in pose that you get in the final painted examples. And finally we have pack BR9, which is British Line Centre Company Marching. This is probably the most popular pose of figures that you'll come across, line marching. And again, the same pack of 4 figures, variations on the theme, same essential pose, and a similar problem here to what I had with the standing troopers. Actually more pronounced because in this particular instance the musket is right next to the shako. One or two of these is actually very difficult to prise away. A little bit of modelling involved to actually get the musket separated from the shako. As you can see, the same attention to detail, the same crispness in the sculpting quality. And another thing I think you'll notice through this is actually that there are very few mould lines. So there's very little cleaning up work has to be done on these miniatures before you actually get to paint them. And as before, here we see a final painted example of the miniatures marching as seen on the website. So there we have it, 4 packs of British Infantry. I think you'll pick up from my comments that I actually quite like these. Certainly they are very different in the fact of they are a different aesthetic from what a lot of people are used to in 28mm miniatures. And from that point alone, an awful lot of people will be put off by them. But I think you'll agree, the sculpting quality is excellent. The minis are particularly well cast. Minimal cleanup is required before you can get going and start painting these. You can also appreciate that the final painted product actually looks pretty decent. One thing to note, as I mentioned with both the standing and the marching poses, you have to be very careful when readjusting these. The actual metal quality on these miniatures, the casting metal is actually quite hard. So because of that, the minis hold their shape very well, but you have to be really careful when bending the metal back into place. Can you relate to the fact that, if you bend the metal, you can almost kind of feel it cracking underneath, and it's resisting it. So you've got to be really careful when changing positions on these particular models. The benefit of this, of course, is things like rifles and bayonets don't tend to get bent very easily. So once they're painted, they're going to stay put. But it is something you've got to be aware of right from the start. So what can you expect to pay price-wise? Well, each of these packs are priced at £5, which is a very average price for a pack of 4 metal miniatures these days. Now, if you include shipping on that, shipping within the UK is £5.50, so that's 10% shipping. It's 15% shipping worldwide, so that's £5.75 a pack. As I said, a very average price for metal figures. I think this is a brave move to make from Alban, especially in a climate where plastic Napoleonics appear to be the order of the day at the moment. They come out with a range that is challenging the accepted aesthetic look of 28mm models, but they're doing so with very high quality sculpted miniatures at a very good price point. So I believe these are well worth checking out. They're available to order from Alban's website, which is albanminiatures.com. Well, that's the end of this first episode of the Meeples and Miniatures miniature review. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if so, come back soon. Bye!